Welcome to Mysterious Universe, Season 24, Episode 9. Coming up on the show, we've got The Room Between Realms, the Premonitions Bureau, and proof Noah's Ark had jet skis and a helipad. I'm Benjamin Grundy. Joining me is Aaron Wright.
Is this some new age theory about what really happened through that Bible story?
This is hard science. Because when you think of Noah and his ark, you think of everything's just made of wood. It's just a big wooden thing.
Yeah, of course you do. Yeah.
There's a bit of hay down on the lower decks. There's some llamas down there.
A lot of white robes, animal hair around.
He's a white robes. Yeah. He's just got
a lot of poop.
He's got a flask of wine to last however long it takes.
A flagon.
And there's poo everywhere, frogs jumping around. No, Noah's Ark was like a billionaire's yacht. It was like one of Jeff Bezos's super yachts.
You know what? That kind of makes sense. I mean, if God is going to save you, he might as well save you in style.
Well, when you actually look into the history of the descriptions, and if you pair it with the idea that Noah came from an advanced civilization.
Right. So, if you're not looking at it from the perspective of it being a biblical story, it's like it's an actual old legend.
If it's a historical account, it was from the civilization before the flood.
So Atlanteans,
highly advanced,
Lemurians.
All the latest gizmos and gadgets were on board. They probably had a jacuzzi on the top level.
So you know what would make sense though? Let's say like 2 of every animal. It wasn't actually real animals. It was genetic samples.
Yeah, like there's
just big
sleeping chambers, freezing chambers.
Yeah,
with all the deposits of the genetic material. So that kind of stuff.
What happened to the technology on the vessel?
Well, it got passed on to the god kings, the descendants of Noah that followed. And all of this is from a book that is $800 in hardback, which I've finally tracked down from René Norbergen, this Dutch author, Secrets of the Lost Races. It came out in the 1970s, but I've finally found a copy. So that's what's coming up on the show.
Well, welcome back and congratulations on the birth of your baby daughter.
Oh, yeah, that happened last week.
Yeah. I mean, everyone's been hanging out. And what was amazing to me was actually when I was recording the show, I even said to our audience, I said, look, as I'm recording this right now, Ben's wife's in labor. And then within an hour after finishing the show, I was expecting it to take all night. You were like, here's my baby girl.
Well, Annalise is born. We're very happy. Thanks to everyone for the well wishes that I've received. And yeah, apparently we'd been hearing up until the due date that the second one's quick.
Right. It's a lot quicker than you expected.
Really quick. And it got to the point where the midwives, because my wife had a midwife, but there's other midwives involved with the group that they run, they would say to my wife, oh, you're the woman that lives in, so-and-so suburb that's 50 minutes away from the hospital. Are you sure you don't want to have a home birth? Because they all thought
who wants that?
They all thought that we weren't going to make it. Because the second baby is fast.
Yeah.
The body's prepared, the body's gone through it before.
And let's face it, the landing strip, the hangar is wider open than the previous time. So
Excuse me. This is my wife you're talking about. You shut your damn mouth. But yes, you are correct. Everything is a lot looser. And as soon as the contractions got to a certain time, I was like, let's go. Thrashed it down the highway, hopefully thinking we'll make it on time.
Avoiding a speeding ticket.
Yeah, and as soon as my wife got into the lift at the hospital, her water broke.
Quickly?
It was just all like clockwork. And by the time we got to the lift, the top of the lift, heavy contractions were starting. Like it was all happening. And we had so much prepared. Like my wife had all these...
candles.
Yeah, we had these little candles.
Plan.
She had these affirmation cards. And she wanted me to pin them up, like had all these messages on how to breathe and, special messages to stay positive and stay focused.
Nope, none of that.
And I started putting them up in the room. Like I actually started doing it. Then I looked into the shower room where she was going to give birth and I realized, there's no time for this.
No.
And then within 5 minutes of that, I caught the baby.
What do you mean you caught the baby?
I actually caught the baby.
But where was the midwife?
Well, the midwife, actually, we had a meeting about it months ago where there was this checklist of all the stuff that you go through for the birth because it's part of they're fantastic, these midwives. They're part of a group.
Oh, yeah, they do great work.
Well, they're part of a group that does totally natural births.
Right.
So no drugs at all, as minimal intervention as possible. And my wife loves that stuff because that's what we had with our first child.
If I was a woman, I would be screaming, get me drugs!
Yeah, well, there's lots of reasons that a natural birth is better for the child as well. So she was happy to do that. But part of the questionnaire we had months ago was, do you want to actually, catch the baby? And as I was filling it out, I was like, no, I don't want to do that. It's too much pressure. I'm not a professional baby catcher.
No.
I imagine you have to do a course. Like, there's got to be a technique. I don't want to. I want someone who does it every day to catch my baby. Don't hand it to me.
Well, also, there's the risk of it. Obviously, it's going to be slippery. Like, you don't want to take that risk.
Well, it's like you going on a holiday somewhere and someone says, do you want to fly the plane? I'm like, no, I don't want to fly the plane.
Yeah, I'm paying you. You're the professional.
I want to sit down and enjoy the flight. So it got to that point where she conveniently forgot that questionnaire. And because everything was so fast and everything was so rushed, she's like, Ben, catch the baby. So I put my hands under and then everything comes out with the baby.
And I bet you were just like, oh, it's so beautiful.
No, I handed our beautiful daughter to my wife and said, you did it, well done. And then she kind of got rushed off to the next room, and I was just standing there like I didn't even
shower.
Dude, I didn't even bring a change of clothes. I was just a mess. Like, I look like I went through hell.
Sam pooped on my midwife the moment that he was born, and she's like, do you want to hold him? I'm like, oh, wait, that's good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, but my wife was amazing. She's so strong. Like, you can really tell how strong women are in that moment. Really are. Like, the threshold for pain is unbelievable.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so much respect. It's just an incredible thing.
So we're super happy. The baby's doing wonderfully. Teresa's doing wonderfully. And I can get back to work now. We're really fortunate because my parents are living with us because of COVID-19.
Yeah, great.
So they're helping at home as well, and we're ready to get back into it. So what have you got coming up for the show?
Well, look, it's really nice that you're back because as much as, it was fine doing the show by myself, it's just not the same. Like, it just feels weird. And then talking to yourself. So I ended up doing the Eye of Fire because it was easy to actually rather read and present a story than to just sit here being like, so what do you think, Ben? And then hearing crickets. So, but that went really well. And thank you to everyone who sent in such kind, nice feedback. There were some really lovely emails that came through. Some people had some really interesting theories about what I discussed on the Plus episode about it being linked in with the same phenomenon.
Real?
Yeah, it was along those lines. And the story is intriguing. Now, if you didn't hear the Plus episode, I certainly am entertaining that these guys, this group of psychics, actually, they did encounter something. Like, they are psychically inclined, they encountered something, but I think it's more likely that it was a manifestation of a very ancient occult magic, which is pervasive throughout the British Isles. And somehow that links in with big cat phenomena. So have a look in the show notes and have a look at the previous Plus episode and check that out and let me know what you think. And I will go into more of that alien big cat stuff possibly next week because I'm really fascinated by this whole idea of these phantom creatures showing up and it being linked in with occult magic and rituals and that kind of stuff. But for this episode, I wanted to do something a little bit different. And on the show in the past, we've discussed the idea of premonitions and dreams and people having strange experiences where they'll have a dream which is quite disturbing and it will continue over and over again and it will later come to fruition. I mean, this seems to demonstrate that there is some type of power in dreams. You shouldn't take every single dream, obviously, as gospel. But sometimes if you listen to your dreams and you record them, you can see patterns that emerge or you can get information that may be able to help you in your waking life. And one area where dreams seem to play a really significant role, which has been lost to modern medical science, is in the diagnosis of medical conditions. That's people suffering from cancer, people suffering from diabetes, a whole range. I mean, anything that you can think of in regards to medicine where there's no actual, outlying indicators or symptoms of you having an illness, but you may have a dream that will predict you having that illness up to 20 years in advance before you actually
develop. That's not very helpful.
Well, it's not, but I guess...
I'm not going to write down a dream from 20 years ago.
No, but for some people, it potentially could be. And the whole argument is, and you made a really valid point, you're right, you're not going to remember a dream from 20 years ago. But if you keep a dream journal and then you regularly kind of do an analysis of it and you look back and try to find patterns, you may actually get some insight as to what is going on in regards to what's happening in your body. And the reason why I raise this is because, amazingly, apparently right now, as horrible as this COVID-19 situation is, and the fact that everyone's locked down and people are being affected by COVID-19, it's a rather auspicious time for the diagnosis of illnesses through dreams. And I found some really fascinating research from a dream researcher at Harvard Medical School. This is Deirdre Barrett, and she's recently published a book called Pandemic Dreams. And this is the kind of research that I absolutely love because the way that they've gotten their research, the way that Deirdre's gotten hold of her, data, is that she's put a call out online for people just simply to contact her, filling out a form, a survey about the dreams that they're having. And she's trying to pull out information from those dreams. And she's finding that there's a whole heap of people now that seem to be able to pull out information from their dreams that gives them an indication about illnesses, but in particular, the pandemic. Now, the reason why this stands out is because there's something that's occurring here that relates to people being locked down.
Wait, so she's suggesting that it's happening more than usual?
Yeah, well, no, it's actually happening as it normally does, but the recall and the documentation of this is happening more than usual. It's because due to the lockdowns, fewer people are setting alarms. So people are actually waking up more naturally. And because of this, they're waking up out of REM sleep. So when you come out of rapid eye movement, if you actually wake up in that state, you're more likely to recall the dream that you've just been having. So the idea is now is that because an alarm, apparently if you set an alarm, it destroys your dream recall ability by up to 80%. And this is why people say, I never remember my dreams. But you'll actually find, and this is from the data, you'll find that people that say that kind of thing, it's more likely that they have a very, very rigid schedule on having to get up for work and their routine and having an alarm going off in the morning, that it's disrupting this dream recall. It's this killer, apparently. So because now people don't have to go into work and, maybe they're working from home, but they're less likely to set an alarm. They'll wake up more naturally.
Because they don't have that bustle of getting ready.
Exactly. Because you can wake up a little bit later, so you don't have to worry about, spending an hour in transport.
No commute, yeah.
Exactly. So all this is happening now where people are more likely to recall their dreams. Now, one thing, obviously, which is coming through, and this is why researchers like Deirdre are really good because, as a scientist, they're able to eliminate things like anxiety, which is occurring, or, at least reduce those outlying cases. And this is what is happening. Many of these dreams probably relate to anxiety and fear about what's happening with COVID-19. There's a lot of, fear out there as to how dangerous this thing is or isn't. And all of that does manifest just normally in our dreams. But what people like Deirdre are actually looking for is the more profound meanings of these dreams and what role they play in people's health. So I'm just going to detail a couple of stories from pandemic dreams and link to it in the show notes. I don't really go into that in too much detail because some of it, is just a little bit, it's not that it's repetitive, but it demonstrates how people are having fear. Like, for example, there was one couple that were really concerned about getting tested for COVID-19 and somehow they knew that they had to go and get tested. But the reason why they knew is because they had a dream where the testing was that they were peeing or they were somehow utilizing pregnancy tests, and the pregnancy tests were showing up that they were positive, and later on, of course, they found out that they had COVID-19. So it's like this weird kind of representation of going for a test, but that in itself could just simply be, anxiety, and they may have been in a hot zone, so this is how the body manifests it in the dream state. There may be no, premonition or anything supernatural about it. But there are plenty of cases through history of where dream premonitions play a huge role in the diagnoses of illness. So later on, I'm going to go into dreams that can save your life, early warning signs of cancer and other diseases. But let me just give you a couple of examples that came from Deirdre's work. She said she had one person who contacted her and said that without knowing that they had COVID-19, they had this dream and they looked down at their stomach. And at their stomach, they had these dark blue stripes. And for some reason in the dream, when they saw the dark blue stripes, this memory came to them, like in the dream, they remembered that they were infected. It was like this, for them,
it's a knowing.
It was a knowing. It was like this first sign that they were infected. There was another case where someone, which didn't actually relate to them suffering.
So that person went and got tested.
Had COVID. Okay. Yeah, exactly. There was another case of a person where they had this dream that they were supposed to be on a spaceship and the spaceship was heading back to Earth, but for some reason it got diverted to Saturn. And when they were on Saturn, they just ended up living there all alone and they were really unhappy. But later on, it turned out that they ended up getting stuck overseas due to all the lockdowns and were unhappy and lonely because they were away from their family. So while it didn't directly relate to a symptom of the disease, it was because of COVID-19 and they had this dream. It was like a premonition that they were going to be stuck somewhere else. And like the representation and the symbols in the dreams, it's like they're in Saturn. They're so far away.
The symbols.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. So, the point is that Deirdre said that she studied dreams of, 9/11 survivors, Kuwaitis during the First World War. Sorry, not the First World War, the first Gulf War, the dreams of prisoners of war and World War II concentration camps. And when you look at these massive data sets, you start to see from these online surveys and just the surveys themselves that plenty of people have these strange dreams that indicate that there's a pattern, that it's more than just simply like a alert system that's inside your body that, because that's been one suggestion, particularly when it comes to disease, is that, well, it's not actually supernatural. It's just that somehow your body knows that something's wrong and it just sends you a message in your dream. But when you have other things that are outside of your control and outside of your body, it indicates that there is something supernatural. There is some type of, premonition that's occurring here. So she says that this combination of global crisis and people having more time to sleep has led to this extraordinary time in history of dreaming. Everything is converging to cause us to have more compelling dreams and to remember them much more clearly. So here's a good opportunity to continue studies. So she will, apparently on her website, you can find more details about the book and also the research she's doing. I'll link to it. The site is just her website. I'll link to it in the show notes. It's linked with the Harvard Medical School. But let's jump now into a book before we go into Dreams That Can Save Your Life. And I want to go into a book by Mary Ann Saunders. This is Nearing Death Awareness, a guide to the language of visions and dreams of the dying. And, it says that pre-death dreams can actually take place with a consistent regularity amongst terminally ill people. So this is something that hospice workers have noticed, what nurses have noticed. It's more likely to come from people that are dealing in hospices because it's kind of end-of-life, help. But they've found that people that are terminally ill start having recurring dreams over the course of consecutive nights, usually just before they're about to die. And it seems to be this weird phase that's not all people, but some people go through having this death premonition, which gives them an understanding that they're about to pass away. And it acts as some type of facility to calm them. When people have extreme fear about dying, all of a sudden when they have these dreams, they suddenly feel fine. They suddenly feel very comfortable about crossing over to the next side. So there's a symptom known as premonition syndrome. And this is really important when we get into the Premonition Bureau, which I'm going to go into, and the details of a man by the name of John Barker. John Barker was instrumental in setting up in the 1960s, associated with SPR, the Parapsychological Research Group. He ended up setting up this bureau that was trying to work out whether or not premonitions actually existed in dreams and how does that link in with the nocebo effect? And could it actually end up killing people? Can people be scared to death because of these dreams that they're having? But more on that in a moment. So there's countless documentations apparently throughout history of this theme of death premonitions. And often the dreamer will actually learn the accurate time of his or her passing from a previously deceased loved one or friend. So there's the example of Gatan David. He was a lawyer and he confided in a friend that he'd never dreamed of his deceased mother in all of his 41 years, just nothing since. She's been 41 years since she died. But one night he had this dream that she approached him with outstretched arms and she was summoning him forth. Now, he woke up the next day and seemed to have this sudden kind of resurgence in his health, which is typical in people that are getting to the end. There's like this final kind of resurgence in health. But he was convinced that he wasn't getting better. He was convinced that that was his mother coming to collect him. And he died that night, which is just amazing. I mean, it could be a coincidence, but it's strange that you'll have a dream about someone you haven't thought about in 40 years or haven't dreamt about in 40 years. And then all of a sudden you die the following night after describing this to someone. The question that is asked is that a premonition? Is that it's some type of telepathic message from someone on the other side? Or is it that the body itself? Two things could have happened here. One, the body knows it's going to expire. And so it tries to calm you by sending an image of someone that you care about to help you go through the death process. It's kind of a materialistic way of looking at it. Or the other possibility, though, which is something that John Barker was looking at, is it possible that when he had that dream, did his mother coming to him actually trigger some type of death mechanism inside him? That he would have been getting better, but because he believed that his mother had come to collect him, it caused him to be prepared to pass away and his body just simply shut down.
Or his mother came to collect him.
Yeah, look, that's a possibility. But, there's an irony that ends up striking, Barker, which I'll get into. And this is why, you're right, there's certainly a possibility that it really was his mother who came to collect him.
Why else would he not dream of her for 40 years and then all of a sudden she pops up?
Because it's like this idea, again, from this materialist standpoint, that your body knows when you're going to expire, or your body knows that things are starting to shut down. So the way that it helps the brain deal with that is that it projects a loved one to you, and you can...
Body just projects a loved one.
Look, I know that
when you haven't dreamt of her for 40 years, all of a sudden your body's like, oh, quick, emergency.
But for 40 years, you haven't been able, you haven't been on your deathbed, or for 40 years, you haven't been about to die. And because this is I don't agree with it, but it's a theory that's out there.
It's nonsense. clearly it's a lovely story. She turned up to collect him.
Look, it is a lovely story, and there are other stories that kind of tie in with this, which didn't come up in the book, but it's a story that I've been reading about recently, and I was going to build it into a segment, but I'll mention it now because it links in, and it relates to, again, a hospice where there's elderly people, and there's this one woman who she ends up getting to her end of life. She doesn't have any dreams, but she starts talking constantly to her husband. Like, she's just chatting away with him and treating him like he's normal, and there's hospice workers coming in, and they come in and say, "Who are you talking to?" And she's like, "That's John. He's fine. Leave him alone." And he's not there. There's absolutely no one there at all. And so they just think this is typical. They see this quite frequently when there's end of life kind of events taking place. And they just indulge them because it's, a good practice from a medical perspective to just allow them, if they're not in danger and if they're not hurting themselves, indulge them in this. And so what this woman ends up doing is that she has a discussion. Apparently she has an argument or something with her husband, like her deceased husband, and there's just bickering. It's nothing major. But he leaves the room and he's apparently gone. And one of the hospice workers walks in and says to the woman, "Oh, what happened to your husband?" She's like, "Oh, he's always like that. He'll be back." And things go quiet until the woman 3 doors down starts ringing a bell. So the hospice worker leaves because she was the only person on at the time, and she walks down 3 doors and she says, "Yes, Mrs. Whoever, are you okay?" She's like, that man won't leave me alone. He's complaining about his wife." And there's no way that these two, it was far, even though I say it's 3 rooms, it's a far distance in that hallway that there's no way that she could have overheard anything, and they weren't connected with each other. And she starts describing in detail this man that was in her bedroom. And the man, allegedly, was the the dead husband of the woman who's been communicating. So it's like there's this indirect validation of the experience that woman is having. So does it suggest that, well, did the actual spirit of her dead husband come to greet her to help her cross over to the other side? And what is odd about that is apparently they make up, as all bickering couples and eventually do. But that woman passed away that night happy and content because her husband, she was fearful. She was terrified of going, and that's why she had the fight. She didn't want to cross over. But for some reason, once this event had taken place, things were fine.
Did I ever tell you the story that my builder shared with me when he was renovating my bathroom?
What was that?
A couple of months ago, I just renovated my bathroom. And this builder, he just had so many stories because he always had paranormal experiences from a young age. And he told me it was only a few years ago, but he had just this really vivid dream of his mother getting into his bed. His mother's passed away. His mother's deceased. She got into bed beside him and cuddled him like she did when he was a child. And he said in this dream it felt exactly the same, and the smell of her and the feeling, and he never actually saw her, but it was just the feeling in this dream, and it felt like it was in the bed he was sleeping in that night. And he was woken up from the dream by his father, who has Alzheimer's, who's living with him in the home. And his father just started screaming his mother's name. It's going, "Margaret, Margaret, 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 Margaret."
That's an interesting coincidence.
And it's funny because I actually met his dad. He brought his dad over because of COVID. Like, he had to get him out of the nursing home. So he's like renovating my bathroom and bedroom, and he said, "Do you mind if my dad with Alzheimer's just hangs out?" So I just had this old guy with Alzheimer's just like walking around my property all day. But
he probably loved that.
He doesn't really communicate much, but just on this night, he just woke up, screaming his mother's name.
It's funny that you should mention that, because those sorts of stories are more common than you would think. And again, this is like this hidden epidemic is the wrong word, because it's not an epidemic, but these are the hidden people. These are stories that don't get told because they do become, they're a little bit taboo, and people are worried that they're going to be perceived as being crazy. But when you start looking at the surveys of these people, like the work of Marianne Saunders, she's had people contact her discreetly about their encounters. And this is a rather sad story, but it's kind of similar to what you were describing there, is that there was a man by the name of Frank, and Frank had this young son. It was absolutely tragic. His son, unfortunately, was diagnosed with cancer, and they didn't know how long his son had. And the son apparently had made some recovery, and he was doing okay, but he was really worried about his son, as you would be. But one particular evening, Frank had this dream where it was more than a dream. It was like one of these particular dreams, and this is a word which is used many, many times when you start looking at these dream researchers. They say when people have these dreams that seem to be premonition dreams or diagnosis dreams, it's realer than real. Now, that's a term that you hear in things like out-of-body experiences, the near-death experience. It's almost like in these dream states, they're accessing another realm which really does exist, and that's the real reality. And what happened to Frank was that when he had this dream that he actually thought he was awake. That's how real this dream was. He walked into his family room, and when he was in the family room, he actually realized he was just two floating eyes. So while he thought that he was, and that's where it was, even though he was asleep, but he thought it was real, that's when he was like, oh, this must be a dream.
That's like a reoccurring dream I have where I turn up to school and I'm just two floating eyes.
Naked eyes. Like that's how it works. Right? So when he goes into the room, he says across the room was his deceased father. And his deceased father had his arm around his, gravely ill son. And the father looks up at Frank and says, don't worry. I know this is really hard for you, but I have to take him. Everything's going to work out okay. He's going to be with me and we'll see you all very soon. Now, he woke up in this sweat and went and checked on his son, and his son was fine. But sadly, a couple of days after this, his son succumbed surprisingly to cancer. Like they had knew that it was a bad outcome, but they didn't realize it was going to happen that soon.
Wow.
So it's it's weird, isn't it? And again, like I really do want to balance this with the arguments that are put forward by materialism, and not while I say I agree with them, but I think it needs to be said because these are the arguments that dream researchers and premonition researchers are being hit with, is that on some weird level, the anxiety about dealing with the stress of his, the death of his son or the impending death of his son caused him to dream about his father taking him away. But I don't know. I don't buy that. It's not enough for me.
You can generally tell when a dream is some kind of weird, like messy symbology versus something that feels
realer than
visceral and real.
Yep, absolutely.
They're very different things.
Further to that, one of the claims is, as I said before, it's like whenever people have dreams about their own impending death or they have dreams about an illness that they may have, it's the body. It's the body generating this. Well, what about when there's some type of external event that takes place? And this relates to a young woman. I don't have her name, unfortunately. The family didn't provide it. But she lived just outside of Jackpot in Nevada. And apparently she had this recurring dream for 6 months that she was going to be involved in an early morning car pileup. And she was convinced that it was going to happen. But she was actually strangely calm about it. And she was so calm about it that even though her relatives dismissed it, she went about getting her personal affairs in order. She had everything in order. And sadly, one morning, she was killed in an early morning car pileup. So she'd been having this premonition. Like this is an actual premonition of death that was going to take place. And the reason why it was so well documented is because she went and got her affairs in order. So the idea that, well, this is just the body, projecting some type of comfort, I don't buy that in that circumstance. There's no way.
You hear that a lot, that acceptance and calmness that comes with these premonitions. I've covered a bunch of stories like that in the past where the person, makes comments to loved ones and friends about how wonderful life is. And, kind of final goodbyes in weird moments.
Yeah.
Because they're having these dreams or these psychic premonitions of what their destiny seems to be.
Yeah, there was one woman actually that I didn't end up including her story, but in Dreams That Can Save Your Life, there was a woman that was suffering from, I think it was metastatic stage 4. It must have been something like that, a very, very bad breast cancer. And fortunately, she ended up beating it, which is almost unheard of the level that she was at. It was such a terrible disease. But the way that she started to know that there was something wrong is that she started to have dreams that were flashes of her history, like these really vivid dreams that were like these long, drawn-out kind of scenes that were taking place that normally are crammed into someone's life when they have a end-of-life vision. So that story or that saying where, if someone's about to die, my life flashed before my eyes? That's exactly what happened to this woman, but it happened in a series of dreams over a period of 6 months or so. And she went and saw a psychologist about it, and the psychologist was like, oh, that sounds like your life is flashing before your eyes. And somehow that was like the final kind of indicator that she needs to get something checked. And she did. She ended up going and getting a mammogram or something, and that's how she found out that, she was suffering from cancer. Ended up beating it, though. And it was almost like this weird dream that she had almost prepared her for like the idea that, well, it's okay, you've had this long, fun life and it's going to be fine. And then regardless, though, she still was prepared to fight this thing and push back, and she did. But, this whole comfort idea plays into a number of stories. And, one thing that you hear, like when we've discussed the experiences of hospice workers in particular and nurses, my favorite story is that, if you recall, Ben, there was an elderly lady and she would do something like just before she died, she packed her bags and Pat got herself into a Sunday best and was sitting on the edge of the bed, she'd say, well, my train's coming. And she was waiting for a train. Apparently, this is really common. In the near-death experiences, at the or end-of-life experiences in these hospices, a lot of the nurses and a lot of the workers say that the imagery that comes up with these people is really common. It's always about travel. It's trains, like I just mentioned, or it's paths, it's bridges, it's gates, it's stairs, and in other times, it's boats as well. It always seems to be some type of transitional kind of thing. Some people describe that there's one woman that got dressed as well, and she was all ready to go. She packed everything up. And when the nurses came in, they said, what are you doing? Where are you going? And she's like, I'm moving home today. And they said, no, you're not. She said, I am. And they just thought that she was, because she was suffering from Alzheimer's, that she was
batty.
Yeah, she was batty and thinking about moving home. She died about 10 minutes later. So it's like...
Maybe she was going home, Aaron.
Well, she was moving home. So she was moving on. She was moving to another plane of existence. But there's this great story about a Marine captain by the name of Charles Rasmussen. And he was dying of cancer. And unfortunately, he was just consumed with fear. He was absolutely overwhelmed with fear. And nothing anybody did made a difference to him. And he didn't believe that there was an afterlife. And he was convinced that this is it. Like, this is going to be a horrible experience. And what a waste of my life. But one evening, he had this dream. And as I said, because he was a Marine captain, he has this dream where he says that all of a sudden I found myself at sea. I was in uncharted waters. He said that it was this odd scene that was before him because he said all the water around him was it was this deep blue, sparkling, radiant kind of scene before him. And he said every time he moved in this water, he just moved forward, he said he had this tingle of excitement again. He said he was pushing through these waves of this vast, dark, empty, yet beautiful sea. And he said, somehow I knew I was on the right course. And he said all of a sudden he knew that this was going to be the next location he was going to. And he said when he woke up, he was so convinced, and this was reported by his doctors, that he'd gone that evening being an absolute wreck and a mess and being on, anti-anxiety medication to being completely happy the following morning, ready to go.
Yeah, wow.
And he died a few days later. It was like this was some type of thing that had shown him. It was like this transitional state to show him, look, this is where you're going to go, and it's not going to be that terrifying.
It's a good way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, we're going to take a quick break here, but when we come back, I want to continue some more of these stories, and then we're going to go into the history of the Premonition Bureau and how it possibly might have ended up causing the death of the person who tried to create it. You're listening to Mysterious Universe. Don't go away. Welcome back to Mysterious Universe. We're talking about strange dream premonitions and how they relate to people that are at end of life and having end of life experiences. And, I wanted to tell you some more of these dreams before we go into a couple of other cases, and then we'll go into the the Premonition Bureau. But Ben, there was a man by the name of Robert DeCastle, and he kept on having patients that would have very strange dreams. There wasn't a lot of them, but he started to notice this pattern amongst their patients, and one amongst his patients. And one dream that really stood out for him was this woman that came in and said that she was having this recurring dream of standing on a river. And when she was standing on this river, every single time that she dreamt this, so this was a recurrent dream, she said that there would be someone on the other side of the river with a beckoning hand, just asking her to come over. But she was too scared to cross through the water. So every time she dreamt this, the width of the river would just shrink a little bit. And it came down to, it was just days before her death when she said that in the dream, she said it had narrowed down to a spring and she could easily just jump across. And she said, oh, that's it. I know that I'm going to die and I'm ready to go. The following day, she did indeed die. And, this doctor was convinced, finally, after having, all these patients saying these things, thinking previously that this was just some type of, again, this comforting vision that comes to people. It's like this Greek representation or, like old folklore representation of like the river Styx and how she's about to cross over this barrier. She's supposed to go somewhere.
Who was beckoning her?
We don't know. We don't know if it was death or if it was a family member. That's not described. But there was some, it was weird how it was just getting closer and closer and closer, allowing her to finally step over. And when she could step over, that was it. So there's also the story of Suzanne. Now, Suzanne was this elderly woman suffering from the final stages of a terminal disease. We don't know exactly what it is. But she experienced what is known as a shift in existence dream. And these dreams are particularly comforting. So what was happening for her is that she was also fearful, not necessarily of dying, but where she was going to go. She was convinced that there was an afterlife, but where is it and what happens and why? And even though she did have this logical understanding in her mind that there is an afterlife, but at the same time there was this feeling inside her, what if I'm wrong? What if it's nothing? And what if I just die and I cease to exist and there's nothing? So she starts having these dreams. And in these dreams, and this was recurrent as well, she said she would wake up in her bed, even though she was in the dream, but she would wake up in the dream on her bed and she would sit up. And when she sat up, she would be sitting inside her hospital room. But when she was in the hospital room, she said the only light on was a candle that was sitting on the windowsill. Now, in these dreams, she's watching, the candle suddenly goes out. Now, when the candle goes out, she wakes up and there's fear and anxiety overwhelming her as the darkness envelops her. Really horrible experience for someone who's suffering from anxiety, that there's a possibility that there's no afterlife, that it's like the candle, you have to look at the symbols. This candle is representing her life and it's going to be snuffed out.
The symbols.
Exactly. It's horrible. Like it's almost the end of her life and this is terrible. But what happens is that she starts coping with this dream because it's recurrent. And she has a dream where the candle snuffs out and then she's like, oh, okay, whatever. Then the next second, the candle goes vroom, and appears on the other side of the glass and relights.
What?
It's like this weird indicator that what this is a transition.
Huh.
It's the other side, the candle, the life, the soul. It moved from this plane of existence to the other side, the other plane of existence. And she died the following day after she'd explained this dream to her doctor, apparently completely at peace. Now, for me, that's pretty cool. I mean, some people say, again, this is some type of psychological calming mechanism.
It's a message from the body.
Yeah, again, I just don't buy that. Take this case of, there was Katie. So Katie had an 80-year-old father. Her father's name was Ed, and he was moved into hospice care. And she, for some reason, she wasn't in the New Age community, but she'd read stories about people having strange dreams towards the end of their life. So she said to her father, just gently, she said, look, just pay attention to your dreams because they might have a message for you. And, he says, yeah, okay, fine. So he does. And he has this dream where he discovers that all of his clothes are all twisted up. And he starts trying to ask the caregivers to give him new clothes. And it was because he wanted to look his best. He wanted to wear his best clothing when he took a trip on the Concorde. Now, a series of dreams after this followed where Ed essentially, because he was scared of passing over, he boards the Concorde in one of these dreams. And when he boards the Concorde, he finds himself working in this weird heavenly location that's known as the Angel Machine. He doesn't know how he knows this. This is just what comes through it. But his task is actually combing out feathers out of the machine. This is this dream that he has. And finally, when he drifts away, what was happening is that every day he was like following this job that he would board the Concorde and actually travel to this location to perform some type of task or role. And his daughter was convinced that what was going on is that this dream was acting as some type of transitionary thing because he started experiencing this as he started in real life. Like he started seeing this moving in. And she was convinced that he actually was going somewhere. Whether
As being an intern.
Yeah, kind of.
On the other side.
It was like preparing him giving him some type of task.
That's why he had such a crappy, simple job, cleaning the feathers. The new guy's here. Like, so tell him to get the feathers out of the machine.
Yeah, exactly.
That'll keep him busy.
But what was even better is there are people that, despite having these, whether it's a comfort dream or having some type of transitionary dream, there are some people that just don't care. Like they're just too set in their ways. They're too fearful about dying and they don't want to go. They are absolutely insistent and they will fight really hard. And some people have this, and you see it in some, it's rare, but in some medical circumstances, people fight so hard until the very end that's really distressing for them. Well, there was this 74-year-old woman. She was dying from metastatic cancer. It was horrible because it had just gone everywhere. And somehow, though, doctors were surprised because she was still alive. She was in a huge amount of pain. and it was just a terrible circumstance for her, but she just refused to give up. And even her family was saying, you can just let go. You can let go. And she said, no, I'm not going anywhere. That's it. I'm not going to die. She was so sick that she starts having these dreams. And in these dreams, she finds herself falling down towards this cement pipe. And it's like this 1 meter wide cement pipe that she's lying at the front of it. And she's lying in this flat position so she can't go through the pipe. And all of a sudden, some concrete thing kind of comes up and starts pressing against her stomach, trying to suck her in, trying to drag her through. And she's actually convinced that this is like a delay, because what it is, this tunnel and this thing trying to suck her through, it's actually like this instant reincarnation. And what was happening is that was the birth canal. And it was like her spirit was being forced on the other side to come through. And she's like, I'm not going anywhere. And here was this tunnel.
She doesn't even get a break in between.
No.
Straight back here.
It's straight back in. And finally, she does pass away, but she passes away comfortably because she's told in this state that she has to put her head first because she needs to go head first through this tunnel to go into another land.
That's insane.
Isn't it incredible? So there's absolutely no in-between time at all. And she does. She passes away. And no one obviously knows after that because she's dead. She can't describe it. But those are the last things that she said that happened to her. So I thought stories like that are fascinating because that's like, it's not even an afterlife. It's instantaneous reincarnation.
Yeah. Because you at least want that nice valley of relaxation for maybe, I don't know,
a couple of eons.
Give me a decade at least before I got to come back.
Well, and that's what you hear from, some psychics and New Age people. They say that every time there's reincarnation, I haven't heard it from actual reincarnation researchers, but it's like there's a 70-year kind of period that people have between each existence.
Yeah, that's right. And when you did your past life regression, if you remember, she actually asked you to describe the place you go in between incarnations.
Oh,
and you've probably forgotten because you
that.
actually started describing a beautiful valley in a forest and little Bambi, and I was like, gay.
No, it was beautiful. Actually, I do remember that. I loved that. It's strange, and I sometimes think of that vision. I don't know about the place because I don't know if I was really there. I don't know if it was my brain generating it in the regression. But that place was incredible. Like I can still see myself flying down onto that location, and I was in space, and it was this red, it wasn't Mars, but it looked like this red planet, and it had this halo kind of over the top of it, and I could see this valley. It was just this valley that was in there, and flying down into this valley, all of a sudden the sky went from being dark to being light. But then I was wandering through, and it was like moss, like green moss and water, and it was like a really typical kind of nature scene. And as much as I like nature, for me, like a really nice, in middle life would be like a luxury yacht somewhere. And in fact, like exactly what you're going to describe.
Noah's yacht.
Yeah. That one,
jet skis and a helipad.
Exactly. A technologically advanced yacht would be fine for, intermediate life for me. But there was something, really comforting about that whenever I think of that vision. But the last story I want to mention out of here as well is just kind of fascinating because it suggests that there's this idea that you'll hear in New Age terms as well of soul groups, and that's when you reincarnate or when you pass over, you basically come to each existence around the same time as your soul group, and you all go through experiences that are somehow interlinked that you're not to know until you pass on, and when you pass on, you finally work out why. But there's this story of a Scot. He was this high school sophomore, and he knew Ryan, who was a senior, but Ryan died in a car accident, and there's a possibility that Ryan, his spirit, hung around before he passed away. Now, Scott later learned that he had an inoperable brain tumor, and he only had a few weeks left to live. And so he started having all this sadness because he's like, he's a young kid. He was really sad that he was never going to get a driver's license. He's like, I'm never going to get a driver's license. This is really horrible. But days later, he started, and it's so typical of a teenager as well. You're not even worried about dying. You're more worried about the fact you don't get to drive a car. But days later, he has this dream where Ryan shows up. In his dream, Ryan shows up in a red convertible and offers Scott a ride. Now, Scott accepts this, and the dream starts indicating to him that this is some type of happy anticipation of a travel dream and that he's going to cross over somewhere. And unfortunately, he died a couple of days later. But when, all this happened, it was indicating that Ryan had been waiting for Scott and was going to cross over with him utilizing this car. So, really warm, comforting kind of stories that you hear from this stuff. But it's not always good. It's not always fantastic. And this is where we have to go to Extraordinary Dreams, Visions, Announcements, and Premonitions Across Time and Place. This is by Kimberly Mascaro. And, she says, look, the idea of extraordinary dreams acting as premonitions have been around since ancient and medieval times. And obviously they've moved into modern times. And divination, dream divination has been used by many, older societies and ancient cultures. But we seem to dismiss it these days. But we really do have to pay attention to the power of our dreams. And she opens with this story, which doesn't relate to people passing away, but it does demonstrate that there is something to people having premonitions in their dreams. This woman awoke at 3:40 a.m. She awoke to the sound of people screaming. She insisted that this screaming was coming from outside. But when she woke up and she got out of that state and was actually fully awake, she said the sound quickly vanished. But when it vanished, she said the room was smoky. There was an unpleasant taste in her mouth, and she just felt horrible. Like, she felt so bad about this dream that she got up with her husband and they scoured the farm that they lived on. They went looking everywhere, but found nothing irregular. And the husband dismissed it and said, "You've just had a really bad dream. And there was no smoke and you didn't taste anything and you're just completely out of your mind." But the following evening, there was a news report from the other side of the city where a chemical plant had exploded and had killed 6 people. The explosion had occurred at precisely 3:40 a.m.
Yep.
Now, what is weird about that is that she wasn't connected with anyone.
Yeah, I was just thinking, why?
Why?
Why did she have the dream?
Exactly. She wasn't connected with anyone that was there. So where this, starts to, give you some indication about the Premonitions Bureau is that, John Barker in the 1960s came up with this idea that what essentially should happen is that there should be some type of bureau, there should be some type of repository of premonition dreams that people can report into.
Right.
They can be critically analysed.
Right. It's like the FBI for dreams.
Exactly. And you can try and formulate some type of, potential,
Right.
I don't know, I wouldn't say like a way to avoid disasters, but maybe save lives. Like, maybe you can, if you get enough dreams and enough indications, maybe you can reduce the likelihood of terrible accidents taking place. So in the 1960s, this is exactly what John Barker tried to do.
Imagine the case file, like the cabinet for dreams where you show up to school with no pants on. It would be a whole floor.
Oh, yeah, that and also finding yourself sitting before a test for something like, advanced calculus, and then realizing that you haven't been to a single lecture.
Yeah.
You're like, what do I do?
Or filleting Lena Dunham or something.
What the hell is going on in your head?
Well, no one else has that dream. That's weird. I thought that was pretty common.
So let's go back and have a look at this Dream Bureau. And this is actually a really good piece that's been put together by Sam Knight in The New Yorker. And there's a full audio edition that they've done of this piece. So I'll link to it in the show notes so you can check it out for yourself. But I'll just give you the gist of this story because it really does tie in with this idea of these mechanisms, these biological mechanisms that may actually exist in the human body, and they run in parallel with this materialist kind of idea. So yes, it might be completely material. There might be a biological explanation for why people have these premonitions, what roles they play in our lives, but it might be twofold. It might be that the premonition actually triggers one of these biological mechanisms. So it's actually linked in together. So it's like it's materialistic, but it's ethereal at the same time. So the story opens with Kathleen Middleton. Now, Kathleen Middleton, like you were describing with your builder, Ben, was the kind of person that was always, psychically inclined. Her classmates and friends said that there was always something different about her. Not exactly exotic, but she was totally different, essentially. And it wasn't just her. It was also her mother. There seemed to be some type of lineage of strange psychic experiences that the family would undergo. Take this, for example. When she was 7 years old, Middleton watched as her mother, Annie, was frying eggs on the stove. And as she was, and this is strange because what would be the point of this? But as she's frying eggs on the stove, it took about 2 minutes. All of a sudden, without warning, one of the eggs started levitating.
What?
It rose up into the air until it touched the ceiling and then dropped back down into the pan. So this wasn't just simply that the pan had been flipped and it had risen up. No, it was a levitating egg that went flying through the room. Now, Annie, the mother, was really disturbed by this because Middleton thought this was just kind of funny. Like, she was a 7-year-old kid. That's really cool. Do it again, Mum. But the mother, Annie, she was like, this is not good. So she went and saw a fortune teller or a psychic. And apparently the fortune teller said, look, anything when an egg moves, I didn't even know this myself, but apparently if an egg moves out of a pan, it's a definite symbol that someone very close to you is about to die. Like, that's all that it is. Like, someone's dead. And she thought,
I thought that was obvious.
I thought it was
a
obvious as well.
levitating egg.
Yeah, a
someone's gonna
levitating
die.
egg is an omen of death. I had no idea. But sadly enough, a few weeks later, actually it was less than a few weeks later, Annie's best friend, who had recently married, died and was buried in her wedding dress. So, a strange kind of coincidence. If it's, like a levitating egg, it's strange. So the thing about Kathleen is that, she had these experiences. It wasn't just this levitating egg all through her life as she got older. For example, she'd have a headache. And this headache would precede an earthquake. Like every time she had a headache, there'd be an earthquake somewhere in the world. Names and numbers would just suddenly flash up before her, which would give her details about people that are surrounding her. And she said she would be drawn by these events. The way that it would take place for her is it would be like an electric light bulb lighting up in front of her. It would be this blaze of light. And, she would do things like, when she got into adulthood, she actually became annoyed by so many of these visions that were coming through to her, that she would sketch down some of the things that were happening, but she was just trying to somehow essentially push these visions out of her. And she said to some of her students, because she ended up doing things like teaching piano, and these students would become friends with hers, apparently they would ask her about these visions that she was having and experiences. And she says, look, I just need to turn them off sometimes. I'm just so busy. I just don't want to see them anymore. And she'd wave a hand, apparently, and this would somehow reduce these visions coming through. Yep. So the idea of, while it sounds cool, to have psychic impressions and visions, it seems like, at the very least in this case, it was something that was irritating and even a detriment to her. But where this ties in with where John started creating this Premonitions Bureau is at around 4 a.m. on October the 21st in 1966, Kathleen was 52 years of age. She's had a lifelong history of premonitions, but she woke up with this terrible, powerful feeling of foreboding. And she said it was so visceral that she actually awoke choking and gasping. And she said she was convinced that the walls were about to fall in upon her. Now, she came out of this dream state and she had a lodger. So she told her lodger, Alexander, about this ominous feeling that she'd had. And it was 8 o'clock in the morning that she was explaining this to her lodger. And the lodger said, look, can I make you a cup of tea? Very British. And normally she doesn't drink tea in the morning, but she's like, yeah, okay, I'll have a cup of tea. Now, little more than an hour later, writes Sam in the article, he says there were a group of labourers who were working on an enormous heap of coal waste in South Wales. They paused to make a cup of tea. Now, as they were there having their smoker or having their morning tea, this pile was on a steep hillside. Now, it had shifted because there had been weeks of heavy rain. Now, all of a sudden, as they were boiling the water over a small fire, the waste began to move, and tall black waves went flowing down the slope when 150,000 tons of slurry rushed into the valley below. Now, this was the town or the village of Aberfan. And I was only talking about this recently, Ben. Remember I told you the story of the little girl that for some reason had a dream. And in her dream, she said something along the lines to her mother the following day that not only was she going to die, but it was okay because little Billy was going to be there and little Sally was going to be there. Yeah. And later
all
on,
friends
it was all her friends because, like 100, I think it was 115 children died in this when this wall of black, horrible tar and sludge hit their school and wiped it out. Apparently, the children would have heard the sound of a jet plane and then the entire thing was buried. Overall, 144 people were killed from this disaster. It was absolutely horrible. 18 houses were destroyed. And in some places, the slurry was about 30 feet deep. So for Kathleen, this was a horrible realization that she'd had a premonition of this, but wasn't able to do anything. It happened 4 hours before this took place. But at the time, apparently Barker, this is John Barker, he was researching a book about something he called psychic death. And he was questioning what happens to people when they believe that they're about to die. And this links in with these death dreams that I was describing, is that someone will have one of these death dreams and a loved one will come to them and start beckoning them. And rather than it being that it actually is a real loved one coming to beckon them, essentially it's a death dream that triggers an innate biological mechanism inside your body which forces you into dying. It's like this terrible nocebo effect. It's the opposite of a placebo. You believe that you're going to die because a family member's come for you, and it just simply happens. So he went to this scene because what he wanted to know is he wanted to know if more people had had these experiences. And while he was writing the book, he heard an anecdotal story which he wanted to validate, that in the early reports that were coming out of Aberfan, there was a young boy who had somehow managed to escape this disaster. He wasn't at school, and it doesn't say whether or not it was a premonition, but he'd somehow managed to escape, but he died of fright later that night.
Oh.
Which is strange, right? So for
he was meant to be there.
Well, maybe, yeah. But for Barker, for him, they're like, this is a case of possibly this psychic death, that all of his friends had died and he thought that he was supposed to die and he'd actually willed himself to die. So in the hours that he spent at Aberfan, he was struck by these strange stories that started coming up. Like, it was almost immediately. For example, on the eve of the disaster, there was an 8-year-old boy named Paul Davies. He had done something very strange. He had drawn this picture of these masked figures digging in a hillside. And underneath it, he just wrote the words, "The End." And his family didn't find it until the following day when he died in the school. So he'd had a premonition of essentially all these workers. I mean, thousands of people descended from all around the country, literally trying to dig people out of this mess. It's incredible that an 8-year-old boy would have that vision just beforehand. And then, of course, the story of that girl, that was Errol May Jones. She was a 10-year-old girl. And she was the one that had the strange experience, recalling that she was going to die with her school friends. But the other thing I mentioned, which I didn't mention, but I mentioned it when I spoke about it on the show the last time, was that when her body was recovered, the bodies sadly were placed outside, and she was laid in the middle between her friends Sally and Billy. I don't think they were their names, but the names that she had described, she was actually physically with them as well after she had passed away when her body was laid down. So
I really admire your ability to finish the segment on dead kids.
Well, I'm not finishing it on dead kids.
It's just amazing.
It is weird how that does.
You managed to weave it in there somewhere.
It's
do you plan it out that way?
No,
do you
don't.
look for a dead kid story first and then try and massage your segment around that?
No, I don't, because I think that's absolute. And now being a parent, it's the worst possible thing certainly for children to pass away. But I think on one level as well, there's a real comfort about this that, if someone passes away, that there is some type of afterlife, and that this is all sadly in some way meant to happen. There's some type of madness behind the terrible things that take place. But no, I'm not going to finish the show on the death of children. What this relates, I will finish it on a death.
On the death of animals.
No, it's not the death of animals, but it is the death. Look, it's the death of a white man. Does that help you? Does that make people feel better?
Sure, why not?
So what happens is that after he got these stories coming out, he decided that, look, he needs to continue with this even more. So he'd written an article for SPR. This is John. And he wanted to know if other people had plausible prophecies of what was going to happen at Aberfan. And, he actually put a call out to his friend. His friend was Peter Fairley. Now, Peter Fairley was a correspondent. He was a science correspondent for the London Evening Standard. And so what happened was that John Barker goes to him and says, look, can you, in your column, in your publication, put out a call for people that have had these premonitions and experiences? And Peter responds and says, yeah, absolutely. This is something that I can do, and it'll be interesting to see what data we get back. And the reason why Peter got so much attention is because he had predicted, on the basis of no more than a couple of ships that apparently were in the Pacific, that something was up in the USSR and that they were about to launch their first manned space flight. And so he ran the story. He took a risk and he ran the story that something was going to happen on the front page. And he was right. That following day, 2 days later, Yuri Gagarin flew into space. So his pay apparently was immediately doubled. Now, it doesn't say, look, this guy is a science correspondent, so it doesn't say if this was some type of premonition, but he had almost no information.
It seems very far-fetched that he would do that if he's a science correspondent.
But this is
What's he basing the story on?
A couple, apparently.
Unnamed sources.
He just said that there were a couple of ships in the Pacific that were in the wrong positions, and he had a feeling that something was up. So pretty strange. I mean, unless he was a spy, but it doesn't seem to be the case that was going. And why would, if he was a spy, let's say if it was a double agent or something, they wouldn't do it. No. Yeah. So look, going back to the appeal, so he did publish this in the World of Science column, and all these stories started coming back through. And this is how we find that Kathleen Middleton meets with John Barker, because she had one of these experiences. She woke up at 4 a.m. choking, thinking that the walls were going to close in on her. So she contacted him. She mailed in her account, and this was in November. And so when he got these experiences, he started working with Kathleen. But I need to give you some details about the history of Barker. Barker basically seems to be someone who may have been psychically inclined as well, but was reluctant to admit it. And what had happened with Barker is that he had essentially become the world leader in aversion therapy. Now, I know that aversion therapy is a really dodgy kind of practice, but there are some cases where it may have some type of use. And back in the 60s, it was readily accepted that it did work. But for example, like he would help people cure them of addictions and behaviors. Like he had a slot machine that was actually inside his office. And what it was is he'd get gambling addicts in.
Yeah.
And he'd be like, if you want to gamble all you want. So they'd walk up to the slot machine and pull the lever. And when you pull the lever, they'd get a 70-volt shock from the lever.
Great.
Yeah. So it's
Cured.
like, keep pulling it. Never worked. Eventually people would work out that I don't care if I'm getting a shock. I'll go and gamble somewhere where I know I'm not going to get electrocuted. But he ended up getting to the point where, as much as he was really good at his research, he said that he was suffering emotional stress almost to the point of cracking up. So he left his job, this prestigious job, and doing this aversion therapy at a mental hospital, at an outpatient hospital in Dorset. And he ended up moving to a location known as Shelton. And when he was at Shelton, people were questioning, well, why did he go there? And people responded, his boss in particular, or his colleagues, and said, look, he was there for shelter. Like it was there because it was a much easier job for him. But he also made, a massive difference there as well. This was a psychiatric hospital. And back in the 1960s, the way that mental health patients were treated was abhorrent. This guy was instrumental in bringing about anesthesia in the use of ECT. So electroconvulsive therapy, where people are electrocuted to bring them out of depressive states. Before he'd made changes, people used to be electrocuted while they were awake. They would put a rubber splint in your mouth and they would fire electricity into your brain. A very painful, very terrible thing to do. And he said, look, you don't need to do that. You can give people drugs and you can still get it to work. And it did. This guy, it goes to show you that he was groundbreaking for the time. But why would a man who was a psychiatrist and so heavily involved in conventional science, why would he be looking at this kind of stuff? And the reason is because apparently Barker's father, Frederick, who was this unassuming accountant, had told his son about some incredible supernatural experiences he had had on the battlefields during the First World War. Now, unfortunately, the details of which are not included in this article, but this took this man of science and gave him this interest in things that are considered to be not science.
I see.
So we skip forward to 1965. This was a couple of years after he'd been at Shelton. And he read this journal article that was in the British Medical Journal. And it was about the death of a 43-year-old woman in Labrador in Canada. And this patient, she was the wife of a fur trapper. She was the mother of 5 children. She'd been admitted to hospital to undergo minor surgery to help her cope with incontinence. And apparently the operation went extremely well. It was a routine surgery. She was fine. It was done within half an hour to an hour. But shortly after she regained consciousness, she started complaining about pain in her left side. She went into shock and her blood pressure collapsed and she quickly died. Now, what the amazing thing is about this is that a postmortem revealed that she'd suffered something called an adrenal hemorrhage, a failure of the adrenal glands. But the thing was, there was no cause for it at all. She had no underlying illness. There was no reason for why the adrenal glands would have shut down. She wasn't using any drugs. It was completely at a loss for the medical professions. But what grabbed the attention of Barker was that she had been told by a fortune teller years earlier that she was going to die at the age of 43. And unknown to the medical professionals, she'd just turned 43. And before she went in for the operation in the previous week, she started telling her family, including her sister, that she was convinced she was not going to survive the operation.
Uh-oh.
And she dropped dead. So Barker,
nocebo or very accurate fortune teller?
well, that's the thing. So Barker's idea here.
You'll be dead at 43, honey.
Yeah, it was like I think it's that Australian comedian Judith Lucy. She had a sand reading, and some psychic got her to stick her hands into sand, and just told her all this garbage. Like none of it was true.
That'll be $40.
Yeah, exactly. So Barker was convinced that this psychic had set this woman up to die because she believed in what the psychic was saying, and somehow some underlying physiological mechanism had been activated. And this is what caused her to die. So in 1942, there was a Walter Cannon. He was the head of physiology at Harvard Medical School. And he'd used the phrase voodoo death. And this was describing, again, this mechanism, this biological mechanism of belief causing people to drop dead. But it was focusing on traditional cultures. Whereas Barker was convinced that this is something that was a human condition and would apply in Western societies as well.
Remember John Keel had a great story like that from Jadoo, where he's travels in Tibet, where there was some kind of witch doctor who said to one of the villagers, because he was wronged or something, he gave him this pot plant. And he said, when this pot plant dies, you will die.
Oh, I don't recall that.
And so this guy was trying to look after the pot plant, and eventually the pot plant died and he dropped dead.
Yeah, right. And there's
Keel was saying it's not really black magic. It's the nocebo effect.
I mean, the Native Australians have stories like that as well. I mean, it's the whole idea of pointing the bone. It's like there's a belief system that if you are, hit by this witch doctor and by these invisible darts, that you will actually die from it. And some people just lay down and die. There's no medical reasoning for it.
Yeah, there's no biological reason for the death.
But somehow it happens. So, Barker continued on this journey, and he ended up getting himself involved with a group of psychics trying to work out whether or not they could predict things and if there were, weird forebodings and that kind of thing. And he didn't really get much. There was this palm reader in London that told him he was marked by a psychic cross. Whether or not that's a good thing, he never actually found out. But after he put out this appeal for people to, write in about their premonitions, there were a couple of people that wrote in. One was a 63-year-old man from Lancashire, and he had dreamt that he was trying to buy a book. And when he faced a large machine, he said he realized it was some machine like putting letters up on the screen. The letters that came up on the machine were Abervan. Like, he had no idea or understanding of this location. It was a word he'd never heard before. And yet some random man suddenly started getting this vision detailing the town where this terrible place or this terrible accident was going to take place. There was a woman from Plymouth, and she had this vision of a schoolhouse being enveloped in an avalanche, which was kind of the same thing. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was along the lines. And then within 30 minutes of the disaster, a 30-year-old film technician jumped from her chair complaining of this earthy, decaying smell, which was that of death. So this is where Barker kicked off working with Fairley to come up with this bureau, which I've been talking about, this idea that they could collate all these stories and maybe they'll be able to get some indication as to, is there a disaster about to take place and can it be avoided? And unfortunately, with all these sorts of things is that it didn't really work out that way. They did get a whole heap of stories coming through, but it was always just vague enough that you could never pinpoint what was going to take place. This idea of having this, mass premonition system that would act as an early warning never really kind of took off. The idea that they could eventually link it to a computer, and maybe things will be different today now that we have big data and we might be able to do that.
Seen some projects trying that with dream databases, and they haven't really gone too far, unfortunately, but the ideas have been there.
Well, the science it was not science, this isn't the right way to describe it, but some of the bigger questions that started occurring in Barker's mind were things like, okay, well, hang on a second. If all these premonitions happen and then the calamity or the disaster is averted, well, then how can it generate a vision to precede it so there would be no premonition and then no disaster? And then, so it was like this weird chicken and the egg kind of thing that was taking place. And so he thought that it's probably not going to work. But in 1967, they did start to get a couple of premonitions that played a role. So, for example, Alan Hencher, he was one of the Abervan seers. Like, he had seen these things, and he calls him up and he says to Barker, look, I predict there's going to be a plane crash. It's going to be over mountains. There's going to be 123 people on board, possibly 124, and it's going to take place. I don't know when.
Specific.
It is very specific, but it's only specific in, here you go, it's only giving you the number of passengers and the fact that it's going to be over a mountain.
Oh, so what are you going to do? Stop all flights?
Yeah, what can you do? And who knows how long that data is? So the idea...
Shut it down, level 4 lockdown,
yeah, exactly.
Social distancing, everyone.
Yeah, exactly. But that you can't, there's no way that you can do that. And everything seemed to be okay, but 30 days later, a turboprop, it was a Britannia passenger aircraft, it was heading towards Cyprus, it was attempting to land in bad weather, it crashed and killed 124 people on board. So he was right. He was right about
all terrorists.
Well, no,
they would have tried to stop that.
No, well, who knows? But it was published in the Evening Standard, by Fairley, proving that at least one of the premonitions that had taken place. I mean, maybe it was a coincidence, but it was a weird coincidence. And much like what was happening with Kathleen, Alan Hencher described that whenever he had these experiences, he would have this physical symptom of this sick headache and this dull feeling until a band of steel would be around his head and it would get so tight that just before it felt like it was completely unbearable, the vision would then come through. It was like this vision was being forced physically through his mind. But you know how he started having these visions? It was after he had a head injury in a car crash. Prior to that, he'd had no experiences, no psychic inclination at all. So it is odd, isn't it, that it's like this combination of the physical causing some type of psychic change. But where this story becomes really uncomfortable, and very ironic. And it fits into what we talk about on the show and this idea of that, we said this phrase of when you start looking at the paranormal, it starts looking back. But over the years, we've kind of changed that. And we've said that when you start messing with the paranormal, it starts messing with you. And depending on just how far you go, it can be dangerous. And on the Plus show, I was talking about this idea that people aren't meant to cross the barrier until it's time. And what that barrier is, whether it's an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience or who knows, if you're not meant to cross it, you shouldn't attempt to do so because the universe will push back. And this is exactly what happened. So both Kathleen and Hensher had some very strange visions. And Barker's telephone rings one day and he picks up the phone. It's a panicked Hensher. And he says to Barker, look, you need to check your gas supply. And I've been really worried about you all day. And Barker says, well, what are you talking about? He's like, there's something really bad going on. You need to check your gas. He's like, there's no gas. I don't have any gas here. He's like, what
was he having dreams?
Just feelings, like just premonitions. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he just had this really terrible feeling about him. He says, do you have a dark car? And Barker says, yeah, it's dark green. He's like, look after yourself. You have to be very careful. I just have a feeling that your life's in danger. And so
thanks for the message.
Like, it's completely ambiguous. It's just like, and of course, this guy's like, okay, well, is he actually having experience or is this just something that's just being kind of blown out of proportion? But then after that, there's another phone call that comes through and it's Kathleen. And Kathleen starts describing that she's like, look, I'm very concerned about you. There's something that's not good. I'm worried that you're actually going to die. And she says, oh, no, come on. And she says, look, you're going to die in this town. She gives the name of this town.
What are you supposed to do with this information?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's like, this is insane. This is like absolutely insane. What is he supposed to do? So more other things, premonitions start coming through where both Middleton and Hastings and, they seem to have, like, all these people start having some strange premonitions and the Bureau does start getting hits. So it is kind of cool. It's like there's shipwrecks that happen. There's tornadoes that are predicted. There's plenty of validation. Like there was one story where Kathleen in April of 1967, she said she suddenly awoke in the middle of the night to have this vision of a spaceman, absolutely petrified, terrified, and just frightened, she says, but it was really visceral. She says that night, Vladimir Komarov, the Soviet cosmonaut, died on his return to Earth. So she had a vision of this. And this is a great thing. This was all recorded before it took place. So there was actually some premonition that has been validated that took place.
So they were getting momentum. It was looking like it could have been a applicable project. It could have worked.
Yeah. And I'm so pleased you said that because what happened is that, as I said with, Barker, he was convinced that there was an underlying biological mechanism with something going on here. And he published his book, Scared to Death, which he published in 1968. I picked up a copy. I found an old hardback copy, which should take a few weeks to get here.
And it was all in French.
It was all in French. No, but what was happening is that it seems like his perception about the nocebo effect was starting to play on his mind because he's got these psychics calling him saying, I'm worried about you. I'm concerned about you. You're going to die in this particular location.
Aaron, I've just been having these horrible thoughts all day.
Yeah.
Do you have any spoons in your house?
So it's starting to...
Get rid of all of them.
Yeah, it's starting to play on his mind. More of these details start being confirmed by about others, like there's train crashes that are validated. Yeah, it's like starting to go, hang on a second, this is real. So he's like, is something going to happen to me? So finally, Hensher calls Barker and he's like, you're going to die in Yockleton. And he's like, like this exact location, right? So it's a secondary validation. So unless these two are talking with each other...
Where's Yockleton?
It's somewhere in the UK. I don't know exactly where it is.
Is it anywhere near where he lives? Does he go there regularly?
Well, it ends up being where he ends up living.
Oh.
So he ends up living in this particular location, right? So nothing happens for 18 months. This is after the Bureau's been launched. But all these validations, all these hits start coming through. And Barker starts getting this state. Remember I said he quit his job because he was experiencing anxiety and he just wanted a more calm life?
Yeah.
This thing has completely triggered his anxiety. He's back in this state again and he's in this mortal anticipation that his life is in danger. So much so that on August the 18th in 1968, he suffers a sudden brain hemorrhage at home in Yockleton. He was taken to the local hospital in Shrewsbury where he died. He was just 44 years old.
Why didn't he listen to them? If someone tells me I'm going to die in Melbourne, I'm never going to Melbourne.
Well, I'm
definitely not moving there.
But he died of a brain hemorrhage. So this is a question. This is I set up with this whole chicken and the egg thing, right? So these people did seem to be genuinely psychic, or at least they were having genuine psychic or premonitions because they were being validated. They were calling up the Bureau and they were writing them down and saying, I've seen this. And then later on, whether it was a month later or, a few weeks later, the event would take place. So there was something that was happening. But was it that this put him into a state where he believed that because he was being told that he was going to die, it caused him to have a brain hemorrhage? It actually caused the brain hemorrhage. Or was he simply always going to have a brain hemorrhage because it was just something that was a time bomb waiting inside him and these psychics could actually see it?
Well, then if it was a nocebo effect, then the question is, how would two separate individuals get that impression that that was going to happen to him?
Well, it just simply could be that they genuinely were psychic and they could see that this time bomb of an aneurysm or a brain hemorrhage sitting inside his head was...
No, but I'm saying in the scenario where it's an aneurysm that's generated by the nocebo effect, how would two separate people have seen something that was generated by him?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, then there's the possibility that, again, it's like this weird cycle. Them having the vision of him having the death had actually triggered it, but then they saw it, so it was a genuine vision. Do you see what I'm saying?
Now we've got a time loop.
Yeah, you've got this weird causal loop taking place. So look, just an incredible story of, and as I said, it's another example of like...
He did.
He started messing. He started messing and trying to prove something, and then all of a sudden at 44 years of age, young, he drops dead from a brain hemorrhage. An amazing story. I'll link to it in the show notes at Mysterious Universe so you can check it out for yourself. And as I said, there's an audio version of that in there as well. I'll also link to those books that I mentioned, and I might go into some more of those books. I'm just running a little bit short, I noticed, because we want to get into your great story, Ben. But I will go into some more of those dreams that can save your life. There's some really great cases in there as well.
Good stuff.
Yeah, let's jump into your stuff.
I love hearing about the dream research because it always inspires me to start a dream journal, because that's really the key to all this stuff is you have to record your dreams. And I remember last time I covered it on the show, I did some segment on dreams and I thought this is it. This is the moment. I'm going to go get a dream journal. And I actually ordered one online. It was like a really nice hardcover with a special case, and I started using it. And the very first dream I had,
Lena Dunham is going down on you?
It was the dirtiest dream. Like I can't repeat it on the show. It was
Lena Dunham.
Horrible, embarrassing, awful sex dream, right? But I thought, because I'm committed to this project, I'm going to write it down. And I wrote down, like in graphic detail, this fucking horrific dream, right?
Did your wife read it?
And ever since I wrote down that dream, I just never wanted to use it again, because I felt like, because I had the intention of having the dream journal, it's like something in the universe was like, well, you want a dream journal? Here you go.
Well, this ties in exactly to what we've been talking about. I really wonder if, especially because
next thing you know, Lena Dunham's oiling herself up in my dreams. I'm like, and I had to write it down. And I didn't use it since that dream. But the problem is, somewhere in the house, right, is this dream journal, because
your mother's found it.
Shortly after that, we moved, and I've got no idea where it is. So I'm terrified that I'll die or something, someday, and then they'll be going through my stuff, and they'll find this dream journal, and it just has one entry of me blowing like tranny Lena Dunham or whatever. I can't even remember what it was, but it was almost that bad. It was really bad.
You know what? If that happens, I will read it on the show.
Okay.
In memory of Benjamin, I'll be reading from his dream journal.
Yeah, that's a good idea. All right, do that. I'll put it in my will. The dream journal that shall not be read shall go to Aaron Wright. That is all he gets. But yeah, coming up in the Plus extension, we're going to go into Secrets of the Lost Races by Renee Norbergen. We're going to look at why Noah's Ark wasn't this flimsy, giant wooden thing. It was actually like Jeff Bezos's yacht, but 100 times better. And we're going to look at the flood myth through history and how it compares, how the different versions throughout the world compare. We're going to look at some of the similarities and then look at a kind of a timeline that this author has constructed of this idea of a highly advanced civilization and the knowledge being retained by Noah and his descendants. And then following this, great wars that eventually destroyed all that retained knowledge from the antediluvian people.
Ah, right. Well, that makes sense, right? Because otherwise we'd still possess the technology.
Right.
It's been lost.
So that's coming up after the break. Noah's Jet Skis. Sign up to Plus, mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. Gets you these extensions we do every single Friday. Big extensions on the end of these shows. Sometimes the show is double the length of the free show if you're on Plus. And you also get an entirely exclusive show that comes out on Tuesdays, an exclusive season for Plus members, concurrently running with this season. And if you sign up for Plus, you also get a higher quality audio version of the show. You get a totally ad-free version of the podcast. You get the features of our apps unlocked as well. And you get access to discounts off digital products in our store. $9 a month helps support your favorite show. It's all at mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. That's a wrap for this free edition of MU. Thanks for listening. If you're on Plus, stick around for the great stuff after the break. For everyone else, we'll catch you next week. Welcome back to a Plus extension.